Good morning, everyone, and thank you very, very much for coming. I want to go ahead and introduce our speaker and the issue as people are streaming in from church, and also welcome people who are actually literally streaming from all over the world to join us today. We are here to talk about mass incarceration and a lot of the facets of it that are just really hurting us as the human family, and also to address a particular proposition that is before the California voters. But for those of you who are streaming from outside the state, what you're going to hear is actually pertinent to the state of the incarceration justice system in our country and also in the world. Before we do that, I just simply want to welcome everybody. If you are a visitor, we have visitor information at a red welcome table on the lawn with red welcome bags that have all of the information about All Saints that you need to take your next step of engagement. Also, today is Pledging Sunday. We have pledge cards at a particular table on the lawn. We would love to have all of you support this place, even though you don't worship here or are not physically present here. We have people from all over the world who are pledging, members of All Saints Church, who find it to be an alternative, a refreshing, liberating, transformative alternative to a lot of conservative Christianity and conservative religions. So if you would like to be a part of that, if you are streaming, you can simply go to the website and there's a donate button and you can press it there and it'll lead you to make a pledge. Also, because our election is upon us and we here at All Saints Church love to talk about sex, money, and politics, we will mention politics right now. We just don't have time for sex today. Unless the speaker wants to go there. Anyway, this is a very, very important midterm election, even for those of us in California, and we have ways for you to pledge to help get the vote out. And so these sheets are all around the room. If you would please fill those out, we would love to have that pledge from you. And Jeanette Miyamoto is in the room. Where are you, Jeanette? Yay, she's raising her hand in the back with a red blouse on. She'll be happy to take your pledges. Also, if you would like to receive an email from me every Thursday telling you what's coming up at All Saints Church, both in the forum and in church, I would love to have you on my mailing list, and you could just give your information to any of us around, and we'll put you there immediately. Our speaker is the President and Chief Executive Officer for the California Endowment, which is a health foundation established in 1996 to address the health needs of Californians. Prior to his appointment, he was the Health and Human Services Agency Director for the County of San Diego and the Commissioner of Public Health for the City of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. His extensive background in health philanthropy as a public health executive and as a physician clinician. His service includes medical director for Link School-Based Clinic Program, Camden, New Jersey, instructor of clinical medicine, Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, and faculty member at San Diego State University School of Public Health. He's a diplomate of the American Academy of Pediatrics, served on the President's Summit for America's Future, and is chairman of the National Boost for Kids initiative. He received his undergraduate, master's in public administration, and medical degrees, all from the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. He was a Robert Wood Johnson Clinical Scholar from 1988 to 1990, focusing on urban child health issues. I'm not going to. I'm just really thrilled that he's here. I have holy pride in the fact that he's an Episcopalian, worships at St. Mark's, Pasadena, and he's a great, courageous, brilliant advocate for children, for health, and what's politically right. Will you please warmly welcome Dr. Robert Ross.
how about a warm, appreciative recognition? I know for those of you that are regulars here at All Saints, Ed Bacon is just your pastor. But I think among the leading championship voices for social justice in America is your pastor, Rev Ed Bacon. So a round of appreciation for Ed. Kind of a troublemaker for the Lord, aren't you? Could add that to your resume. This room is wonderful. What a great room. It's really one of the best set up rooms for a conversation that I've seen. So thank you for having me and us. My wife Robin is here, and a couple of friends from St. Mark's, and our youngest daughter. And so thank you for your attentiveness to this conversation and this topic today. What I want to do, I know you guys have a hard stop in this room at 11, right, Ed? So if you could make sure, and maybe my wife will do this, at 1:15, I need to stop so we can have time for questions and conversations. And if somebody else does it, I might not stop. But if my wife tells me to stop, I'll stop. So here's what I want to do. On your seats is some information about a ballot measure called Prop 47, which is probably the most progressive piece of ballot legislation to redo, re-engineer the prison pipeline. I am not here to advocate for that proposition. I'm here to talk about the bigger issue of the incarceration pipeline and how to undo it. Our tax status doesn't permit me to lobby, so I can't tell you how to vote, but I can tell you to learn as much as you can about that particular ballot measure. And there are folks here that are actually more expert in the ballot measure and the campaign. I think Jeanette and Hilda, right, are both here. And so if you want if you're so inspired to join the campaign after this, then you should see them and not me. But thank you for your support, and thank you All Saints for taking the courageous stand to endorse this ballot measure, and I'm going to tell you why. Let me give you a little bit of context. This is my third career. My first was as a practicing pediatrician. I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about that. Then running public health departments on the East Coast in Philadelphia and in San Diego County, and the work we do now at the foundation, which is about community health. And I want to tell you about that transition from being a practicing pediatrician and physician to the work we do now and sort of why that happened. And it started in the 1980s. When I finished my pediatric residency training at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia and joined a public health center, a community health center in Camden, who, for those of you who are not from the East Coast, is a small town across the river from Philadelphia that has been beset for decades with crime, poverty, and unemployment, continues to struggle, although they're doing a little bit better now than they were 20 years ago. Camden is, if you think of sort of Compton in New Jersey, that would be Camden. Okay. I arrived there in late 1983. It was my first job at a pediatric residency as a pediatrician in this community. And within a year, the lid blew on the health of that community. It had already been an impoverished community. It was an impoverished but proud community. And within a year, it turned from an impoverished, proud community to one that was reeking of hopelessness. And in that year, in Camden, but it also was a phenomenon that swept across urban America, we saw extraordinary increases in felonies and in property crimes. We saw increases in prostitution. We saw increases in sexually transmitted disease, in chlamydia and gonorrhea and HIV/AIDS, in syphilis, which was disappearing from the public health screen in the 1980s, came back with a roar in the mid-1980s to late 1980s. We saw increases in infant mortality, in premature birth. We saw increases in child abuse, sexual abuse, family violence, and domestic violence. We saw increases in homicides, youth homicides, and drug gang shootings. So who here is going to tell me what happened in the mid-1980s? Say it. Crack cocaine. Now, crack cocaine did not, poverty and hopelessness did not begin with crack cocaine. However, crack cocaine served as a catalytic trigger, and I'll sort of explain all of those trends and phenomenons in a second. So if you all of you take out your car keys for a second. Most of you on your car have this little car security thing, right? Doot, doot, doot. This thing, right? This is a crack cocaine phenomenon. And the reason is because in the mid-1980s, those of you that are old enough to remember, everyone was getting their cars broken into. And in fact, if you lived in Philadelphia or New York City, I don't know whether that was happening out here in Los Angeles, Ed, you would walk down the street and some people would actually have a sign in their car that said, "No radio." You remember that? Now, do you remember the development of the removable 8-track tape? For those of you old enough to remember, I see some gray heads around here, okay? And the removable sort of stereo system. Here's what crack cocaine did. Before 1984, poor people couldn't buy cocaine. It was too expensive. You could not buy cocaine unless you had more than $100 of cash flow in your pocket, until some evil genius created crack cocaine. And all of a sudden, the affordability price point for cocaine went from $100 and up to as low as, how much? $5. Okay? So you could get a hit of crack cocaine for $5. Now, cocaine, pharmacologically, for those of you with some health background, is a very short-acting, intensely euphoric drug. It's metabolized very quickly. It's very different than heroin, which takes a long time. Heroin can hang around in the bloodstream for 8, 12, 16 hours. Not cocaine. Cocaine is metabolized in about 20 or 30 minutes. That's about how long the high lasts. It gives you a sense of intense euphoria and well-being for about a half hour, and then you want it again. Okay? And then you want it again, and then you want it again. So if you want a passport out of your misery or your hopelessness, crack cocaine gave you that for about a half hour, but then you had to go back and get it. And so if you're a male and you're addicted to this drug, pretty soon you run out of $5 bills. And what do you do to support your habit? You steal. You steal from cars. You break into cars. Remember the club? Does anyone still use the club anymore? Out went the club, and in came these, right? Because everyone was getting their cars broken into. People were stealing from their grandmothers. If you remember the film Boys in the Hood, John Singleton's film about South Los Angeles and the crack epidemic and what it did to families and neighborhoods and communities, you get a sense, even a Hollywood style, of what was happening in those communities. Now, if you're a young male and you are an entrepreneur, and you can resist the lure of drug addiction, but you want to make money, then obviously selling crack cocaine became a ready path to entrepreneurship and a lot of money. But pretty soon, you had drug gangs building up around the crack cocaine industry and epidemic, and if you had a competitive problem in your neighborhood, you couldn't go to the Securities and Exchange Commission to deal with that, right? You had to protect your turf with advanced weaponry, and all of a sudden drug gangs, heavily armed drug gangs, just spread like wildfire across the country. And then we saw the homicide rates, particularly among African American males and young men of color, just explode. If you were a female and addicted to crack cocaine, how did you support your habit? You sell yourself. Right? And so we began to see extraordinary increases in sexually transmitted diseases as a result of that. The way this phenomenon spilled into my office is, as a practicing pediatrician, I would attend all the complicated deliveries in our practice in Camden, and I went to literally hundreds and hundreds of deliveries for what were known as crack babies. Okay? Babies who were born at 25, 26, 27, 28 weeks gestation instead of 40 weeks gestation, partly because when you are addicted to crack cocaine as a mother, you forget that you are a mother, and also because of the pharmacological effect of cocaine on the uterus, which is, cocaine is a muscular stimulant. The uterus is basically the largest muscular organ in the female body, so that crack cocaine does tickle and stimulate those nerve fibers and muscular fibers in the uterus, and those babies were being spit out at 6 months gestation. I went to a lot of deliveries of babies that were born at 1 pound, 1.5 pounds, even a half pound. Okay? And so this was a phenomenon that was happening across the entire country during that period of time. And America's response was 3 strikes and you're out. America's cultural, civic, law enforcement response to this phenomenon was incarceration. Okay, and I think you guys, you've had Michelle Alexander here, right, Ed? Well, you're studying her book. Michelle writes about this beautifully in The New Jim Crow. And it's interesting to read her legal civil rights orientation. Well, I had experienced my own public health and community health orientation, but it lands us in the same place, which is when you add something like crack cocaine to a toxic brew of poverty and hopelessness, the lid blows on a community. But our national response, and this is an issue that comes up in our criminal justice system quite frequently and often. I'm just giving you sort of a snapshot of it. But oftentimes our response of our civic society through the lens of public safety and criminal justice is that we criminalize sick people. We criminalize sick people. And that's what happened with crack cocaine. That's what gave us 3 strikes and you're out. That's what gave us zero tolerance, a culture of zero tolerance. Right? And we have had this phenomenon for 30 years. Right? And since 1980, just as a snapshot of this phenomenon, in the state of California, we have built 22 new prisons and 1 new public university campus. Okay? And that is a national phenomenon. So let me now switch to 30 years later, because at the California Endowment, again, we're a health foundation, we're not a criminal justice foundation. And the reason why this issue just blew up on our radar screen as a health foundation is because we do a lot of work with communities called Building Healthy Communities. We're in a 10-year campaign. We're in 14 communities around the state of California, communities like the Iron Triangle in Richmond, West Central Fresno, City Heights in San Diego, Boyle Heights, South Los Angeles, Salinas, Coachella, not places like Malibu or Brentwood or San Marino, right? And in these communities, what we heard from community leaders, and in particular the youth leaders, is that the prison pipeline is unhealthy for our community. You, California Endowment, have to support us in a way you can around this issue. So we have found ourselves drawn into this issue because the issue of the prison pipeline has had a significant impact on health and well-being and wellness in these particular communities. So we began to listen to young people, and I'm going to play a couple of videos just to tell you sort of what we heard and learned, and I'll get back into the strategic aspects of this in a second. Let's see if this is going to work. This is one video inspired by the voices of our young people.
Or drug possession. That's almost 30,000 inmates. The result? More inmates equal more prisons. Since 1980, California has built 22 new prisons, but just 1 new university. Does this add up for California? We spend $62,300 a year to keep 1 low-level offender in prison. That's more than 6 times what we spend per student in our public schools. Just think of what else we could do with that money to help kids have a successful and healthy life. Send 15 kids to preschool, which lessens their chances of going to prison by 28%. Hire a school counselor to address kids' mental health needs so they stay in school. Send 2 students to UCLA. We can spend a dime now or $1 later. You do the math. Health happens when California values schools more than prisons.
I want to go to Stanford Law School so I can be in the Supreme Court. When I grow up, I want to go to the police academy and become a police officer.
When I grow up, I want to go to the California Institute of Technology and invent something more important than the internet.
When I grow up, I'm going to go to UCLA Medical School and be a heart surgeon.
Since 1980, the state of California has built 22 prisons and just one university. I wonder what they imagine we will be when we grow up.
So those are scripted by the voices of youth and community leaders in the 14 healthy community sites. This is the messaging that they want. We helped them out by getting a little bit of glitz and social media support. Let me shift to what the answers are for a second. And the answers to this obviously are not easy. This is a complicated issue. It has to do with poverty and racism and unemployment, a lot of very complicated issues. However, the data tells us that there are 4 or 5 critical opportunities to be smart about undoing this pipeline and restoring it with a highway, with an opportunity highway. Okay? The first, and if there are any school teachers here, you'll understand this immediately, and if you're a parent, you'll probably get this pretty quickly too. One of the early indicators is 3rd grade reading levels. Okay? The data shows that for African American boys in public schools, urban public schools across this country, 75 to 80% of African American boys in the 3rd grade are reading at less than grade level proficiency. Let me say that again. 75 to 80% of African American boys in urban public school districts across this country are reading at less than grade level proficiency. As parents, you've raised children, you know between the ages of 3, 2, and 3rd grade, basically your children are learning to read. Okay? After 3rd grade, you read to learn. If you don't have that foundation, you are asking for trouble. Okay? And so there have been some internet myths that actually prison construction planning is informed by 3rd grade reading levels. I've never been able to find that. I've been chasing that factoid down for years, and I've never found a piece of paper that tells us that. However, I did find an article that said 3rd grade reading doesn't predict incarceration rates, but it could. So that's one thing that's fixable, that's doable. It's not a 3rd grade teacher problem. It is an early childhood issue. And so focusing on in those early childhood years, on literacy and reading, particularly in Black and brown young men who've been disproportionately incarcerated, a critical intervention point. Point number 2, truancy and chronic absenteeism in schools in the early grades. The data are powerful about missing more than 10, if you miss more than 10 to 15 days of school per year, the chances that you are going to drop out of school increase significantly. Right? So we need to be able to look at early grade truancy and early chronic absence in the early grades, 3rd grade, 4th grade, 5th grade, 6th grade, as a marker. It doesn't mean the child is destined to go to prison, but it's a red flag. Okay, and the data are very strong on that. 3rd, school suspensions. In the state of California, research from USC tells us that if you're suspended from high school even once, your likelihood of attending 4-year college is reduced by 70%. Your likelihood of attending community college is reduced by 42%. Okay. Suspensions are a marker for childhood trouble and childhood trauma, I believe. Okay. And ever since 3 strikes and you're out on the criminal justice side and 0 tolerance on the education side, we have a 0 tolerance culture that says when a kid acts out, get him out of the classroom. Okay? And the U.S. Office of Civil Rights has shown that African American boys, no surprise, and Latino boys are disproportionately and negatively impacted by this issue. This is a national issue. It's not just a California issue. A study showed in the state of Texas that 1 in 2 high school students in the state of Texas had been suspended once. Okay? This is different than when you and I went to school. This is different. Okay? Because when you and I went to school, if somebody got suspended, that was a really big deal. Right? Oh my God, he got suspended? He was selling drugs out of his locker while the principal caught. That's how you got suspended. If you or I got in trouble when we were in school, we got sent down to the principal's office. We got kept after school. In my school, I went to Catholic school. In my school, they sent you to work with the janitor, cleaning up the grounds after school. But they kept you in school. They kept their arms around you. That phenomenon has changed in the last 30 years. Suspension rates went through the roof across this country, and it was a zero-tolerance culture that reflected the 3 strikes and you're out in the prison system, right? So if we can get our arms around the suspension rates and turn the tide on those suspension, and at least provide teachers and schools with the tools, training, and resources they need to support these kids, then we can do better by these kids. Now, in the last 2 years, because of this campaign, which our young people have led across the state of California that we've helped fund, we've seen a reduction in suspension rates by 22% after 30 years of an increase. Okay? So this is a fixable, doable phenomenon. In many schools, they're using restorative justice training and practices and programs. They're also using behavioral programs. In a couple of school districts that are really out on the edge are using even mindfulness and transcendental meditation. There's a school district in San Francisco, no surprise, and they're using an approach called quiet time, where the teachers, faculty, staff, and administration spend 20 minutes in the morning and 20 minutes at the end of the day doing meditation. Increasing scores, reducing violence, completely eliminating school suspensions, and now school districts are coming to us to try and fund more of those kinds of programs. So we do have alternatives at work. And then the last piece, other than some of the obvious stuff, mentoring, summer jobs, internship opportunities, but the last piece is this issue before the California voters coming up, which is juvenile justice and criminal justice reform. Okay? That we got to have sentencing reform. We've got to bring pragmatic, common sense, accountable but common sense ways of dealing particularly with lower level crimes, crimes that are not violent felonies, many crimes that were captured as felonies which could have been handled as misdemeanors, and try and deal with these folks in community settings that are supportive, particularly if there's a drug issue, getting them the mental health and drug supports they need, and not just locking them away and throwing away the key at $62,000 per year. Okay? So if I were sort of the czar of this issue for the nation, those would be my 4 or 5 points, and they're fixable, doable things. Okay? They're not easy, but they are fixable, they are doable. There's data that shows alternative practices work. How long are we going to have to take before what Father Greg, you've had Father Greg here at Homeboy Industries, he's been doing what he's been doing for 20 years, but why does the LA County Probation Department not run its program the way Father Greg runs his program? Okay? That's a voice phenomenon, that's a power phenomenon, that's an advocacy phenomenon, that's not a lack of data or lack of smart alternatives phenomenon. Right? So that's the moment that we're at. The last thing I'll say, and then I'll open it up for comments and questions, is we have opportunities to do this with existing money and resources. Now, I'm not against more taxes for more after-school programs for kids. That would be wonderful. But with the resources we have now, this is doable and fixable, and California is poised to lead the nation. If you're going to wait for Congress to fix this, you can forget it. Okay? And if you're going to wait for Sacramento to fix this, you can forget it. This is going to be a community-by-community phenomenon. Although this is one of incarceration reform is, Ed, one of the very few things that some Democrats and some Republicans agree upon. Okay? Newt Gingrich has supported, Newt Gingrich and Jay-Z agree that Prop 47 is a good idea. I'm not telling you to vote for Prop 47, I'm just reporting that fact, right? But when Newt Gingrich and Jay-Z agree on something, that kind of gets your attention, right? But we have, through the Affordable Care Act and the expansion of Medicaid through Obamacare, we have the ability to get more behavioral and mental health and support services for these kids through the healthcare system. Through the local control funding formula, which is a school equity formula, which gives more money for schools with high percentages of children in poverty. We have more education dollars poised to follow these kids and get them the kind of supports they need. And if something like Prop 47 passes, it helps move money, the savings from incarceration, into needed programs for kids, after-school programs, mental health, drug treatment programs. So there is a way to get there from here without some fantasy-laden, huge new tax increase. We can get there with existing resources. So with that, I'm going to stop, and I just want to say to you, Ed, and to the good folks here at All Saints, thank you for being champions for social justice, and thank you for being supportive on this issue.
Okay, the mics are coming. We have to have a mic in front of you in order to hear you and your question on streaming. We'd like to have 2 mics in the hands of people so we can do lickety-split. So here's going to be the first question, and here's going to be the second. Please, sir.
Do you feel the Attorney General at the federal level and the state Attorney General, Kamala Harris, have been effective? I know they've harped on this subject a lot. Do you see the activities or actions having some impact anyway on this problem?
Yeah, thank you. So I think both our Federal Attorney General, Eric Holder, and Kamala Harris have been terrific generally on this issue, but they're not alone. Most law enforcement leaders, even gun-wearing, badge-toting sheriffs and LAPD chiefs, if the LAPD chief were here or the new incoming, is McDonald elected yet or not yet? Okay. That wasn't an endorsement. Whoever the next LA sheriff is, you'll hear from law enforcement leaders, we cannot continue to arrest our way out of community safety issues. Okay? Even they get that. This is why even Newt Gingrich says, wait a minute, we need to think about how we're spending our resources, investing our resources. So I think you're beginning to see law enforcement leaders talking more and more, like Jackie Lacey, about mental health supports, about behavioral health supports, about not only reforming sentencing, but also what happens to these young people, young men and women behind bars. I just met someone here who's Claire, who's teaching at a juvenile facility. But we need to turn prisons into college. Right? I mean, we need to make sure that there's a restoration of hope while they're behind bars, and that's what true rehabilitation means, not just locking them up to learn how to be a better criminal, right? So I think Eric Holder in particular and Kamala Harris have been generally terrific, but again, the people must weigh in and speak with power, voice, and authority on this issue.
Please.
You've done a fantastic job of drawing some parallels that really highlight the differences in our outcomes for different decisions that we have presented to us. It looked to me like there are 2 very strong points. One was on the education side, and right in Philadelphia you have a strong parochial Catholic school-led program that is having tremendous success in changing behavior of students and has an overwhelmingly high percentage that go on to college, 90+% from inner city kids. And they have limited residence on campus. If you look at the residence programs in 2 educational systems, one is keeping them in school and getting them a good broad education. The other is sending them off to prison, which is also an educational institution. They're both supposed to change behavior and give them new skills. But the prison side of it gives them new skills focused on the criminal justice side, on the criminal side of the criminal justice system, and gives them those skills when they release, and costs several times as much. So it looks to me like that decision is a no-brainer, that if we can keep kids in school and give them an education, the outcomes are vastly better for them and for the rest of society. And we look at the program where schools are saying, well, 1 strike and you're out, 0 tolerance. And we haven't advocated that same decision process for parents and said, hey, look, if your kids misbehave, just throw up your hands and stop feeding them and don't do a thing with them and don't give them any instruction. If it's logical in school, that would be the logical extension of that thought process, and we don't advocate that, obviously. Yeah. And so the thought that schools are supposed to help them reach a goal of well-adapted, socially adjusted, educated students, then it points to a different set of decisions there as well.
Yeah, so Let me put my pediatrician hat on just for a moment again. What is going to be needed concurrently, and I think in supporting these kinds of efforts, and I'm going to use a term here that's a little bit loaded. We need to get smarter as a civic society about the trauma that young people are dealing with. Okay? If you go to a women's prison, and which I have done, and you ask 50 women in a room, how many of you have either been sexually or violently abused, you will see every hand go up. Okay? The data and the correlation between sexual abuse, physical violence, if you want to Google something called ACEs, A-C-E-S, which is the Adverse Child Event Survey. It is a retrospective study that showed that adults in poor health, you can trace back that poor health to adversity and trauma they faced in childhood 40 and 50 years previously. Okay? And the more episodes of childhood trauma you've been exposed to, the worse your health gets. Okay? The data is very strong on this. All right? And so that old adage, time heals all wounds, bull dinky. It doesn't, right? And so I think the answer is that we need to get smart about being trauma informed. I suspect that most of the kids acting out in behavior causing them to get suspended have been traumatized. I'm not excusing it. I'm not saying they don't need to be held accountable for it. But I think we need to recognize that a child acting out in the 8th grade probably has something going on at home that's probably pretty significant. And the worst thing you could do is to suspend that kid from school. Never mind expel them, right? And so there's a slow-growing movement called trauma-informed culture, where in the school settings, in the juvenile justice settings, in the criminal justice settings, we need to recognize this is why people turn to crack cocaine. They're trying to self-medicate at something, right? And being smart about that. And the last point I'll make, which is another issue, not on these screens today, and maybe a topic for another Rector's Forum, Ed, we're seeing sexual trafficking explode in girls. It used to be an international issue, it's now a domestic issue. It's a domestic issue because the drug gangs have figured out that you can sexually traffic a girl at the age of 13, 14, 15, and make more money than selling drugs, and you will not get prosecuted. Okay? That it's a safer revenue stream for a drug gang. Okay? We've seen sexual trafficking, human sexual trafficking in California go through the roof. They're making between $100,000, $200,000, and $300,000 per girl from FBI data. Okay? They show up in our systems as prostitutes. So it's a stark example of how we, remember what I said earlier, how we criminalize victims? Okay? So they show up in our courts being arrested for prostitution and selling themselves, but they've really been victimized. Okay? And so our systems, just in juvenile probation, in the courts, in the schools, in the healthcare system, we need to get smart about this. It's the same narrative change, and I'll end on this point. Remember when it was okay? Remember when domestic violence was okay? Right? Particularly the older women here, when if you had a friend of yours that was getting beat up, that was a private family matter, right? And we've seen in the last 20 years a substantial change in the narrative around domestic violence, such that even NFL players, right, are now, right? Okay. So this is what has to happen, I think, on this issue of trauma, Ed, and criminalizing victims, that we've got to change this American narrative from it was your fault to what kind of support do you need? And that's going to take quite some time, but it needs to happen in the schools, it needs to happen in the neighborhoods, it needs to happen in the juvenile justice system, it needs to happen in the criminal justice system, it needs to happen in healthcare. That's what has happened in domestic violence. Okay? And we need the same thing to happen here. Thank you.
Before we thank Bob, I want to say that I am very strongly supportive of Proposition 47 and the vestry. And the vestry has voted to endorse it, not unanimously, but by a great majority. There is a fact that we cannot respond to mental health and addiction through incarceration. It is ineffective. There is a change going on in this country to move away from mass incarceration. And this proposition is a start. Smart, reasonable people disagree with me and disagree with the vestry and point out places where this proposition is imperfect, which it is. I believe that it is a start, just like Obamacare was a start. Sacramento is scared to enact progressive legislation around this. We will not get them to do it. I have all sorts of criticism about the proposition method in California, but this is a proposition where I think the people are more progressive than their representatives in Sacramento, and we can go back to Sacramento and get them to take some conservative tweaking on it, but we can't go to Sacramento to get them to take a progressive stride about it. So I hope that you will go to the action table today and you will have ballot proposition guidelines which give you pro and con on this proposition so that you can make this decision for yourself. Now, I'm closing the parenthesis on my using my pulpit to say what I believe. And now we're going to go back into Brother Bob Ross, who did not endorse this proposition while I was here. I have a little more freedom than he does in these matters. And I want to invite you to please help me thank him for this wonderful presentation and his courageous, wonderful leadership. Thank you, Bob Ross.